Good afternoon and welcome to the last day of the Nordic Climate Action Weeks here at Nordic House in Stockholm. And welcome to our audience in Madrid at the Nordic Pavilion. And welcome to the online viewers watching us just now. My name is Stian Fjella. I work for the Nordic Council of Ministers. And today we are going to talk about aviation. It's a flying shame. Nordic efforts towards sustainable aviation. The Nordic countries are on the forefront in exploring production of sustainable jet fuels. We have mandatory blending of sustainable jet fuel at several airports. And we have ambitions to become frontrunners on electric aircrafts. And at this event, we'll get into the matter of sustainable aviation on many levels. But we'll start with flight shaming. Maria Wollratz Söderberg and Nina Worms from FORES, the Forum for Reforms, is a green and liberal think tank. You are the authors of the report Grounded Beyond Flygskam, as you say it in Sweden. A study of some of those who have stopped flying and why they have stopped flying. And you'll present some of the results for us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stian. Yes, we've been looking at people who want to try and make a difference. And my name is Nina Worms. I'm a researcher and a professor in history of technology at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And Maria, you're?
I'm Maria Wollratz Söderberg. I'm a researcher in rhetoric at Södertörn University, south of Stockholm.
So we've been engaged in climate research for some time, and we've been wanting to study the people who have a sustainable lifestyle, sustainable ideas, high knowledge, and want to do the right thing, but fail to do so. And very often when we ask them and look at their arguments and in which situations they find themselves, transport is very often a time when they don't manage to do the right thing. And most common is flying, actually. So when we discovered that, we wanted to look at people who actually stopped flying for climate reasons and ask them what made them change. So we've done a survey on we had originally over 800 responses, but we've analyzed 673 open text answers, where people detail their reasoning for stopping to fly. And we've grouped them in four, so why don't you start with the first one, Maria?
And we were kind of surprised. It wasn't exactly what we expected. First of all, the most common argument was knowledge. And it has been said for a while that knowledge doesn't seem to help. People know a lot, but still don't act in accordance with their knowledge. But here it seemed that for almost all those who had changed their behavior, knowledge was very important. But it wasn't any knowledge. It was knowledge on the acuteness and severity of the climate problem, and it was knowledge on proportions. What impact, the size of the impact in this situation, it was the impact of flying. And many witnessed that they had known for a while that flying was a big climate problem, but they didn't understand how big and how much green gas emissions of their own footprint that came from flying.
This is interesting because it points to the fact that these people not only have learned about the proportions of their own impact, of their own footprints, but they also realize the footprints of others and the expected footprint to reach the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. So these are knowledgeable people. They've sort of overcome that threshold of knowledge and action. Mm-hmm. And this, in turn, might have led them also to the second most general conclusion, and that is that flying is actually a question of justice. So they make it a moral issue to fly or not to fly. These are very common arguments, and the arguments relate to for example, to people that they care about, their children. So they don't want to fly because of their children, because they will not be able to fly, or climate change will affect them. But also in relation to other people in other countries and future generations. So knowledge in turn makes this a moral issue and an issue of justice.
And it seems that when they have accumulated a certain amount of knowledge and they have realized the size of their emissions, often from a climate calculator or something similar, they get very strong emotions, fear and bad conscience. And we don't see very much of shame, which could have been expected. Somewhere in behind, there is some kind of social dimension in the reasoning, but it's not very articulated. But what is articulated is their own conscience, their moral reasoning. And it's not only about justice, but it's also about hanging together as a whole. They can't stand the split between their own reasoning and their living, or between the identity that they believe that they have and how they choose to live.
They want to practice what they preach, and that's a common way of describing it. And in doing that, they feel this process is very often related to input from others, right? So they are influenced of the media debate. They are influenced by role models. They can be scientists. They can be a friend. They can be a close colleague. Or very often it's the family. And the children come out as one of the most important influencers, both when it comes to knowledge, right? They come home and they got new knowledge. And they want to eat something different. And they don't want to join in the weekend trip to London. Those are social contexts that matter a lot for these people. The one who's most mentioned, of course, is Greta, for all of these reasons, right? She embodies knowledge, and she practices what she preaches, and she is the future generation. So she sort of coalesces, in her everything coalesces, I think.
And it's interesting that it seems that almost nobody in the study mentions only one reason not to fly, but it's when many reasons, the knowledge, the moral emotion, and role models and the social discussion, when it comes together, that's when people change behavior.
And there is also, we find this hopeful, and there's hope. People also express hope, and they seem to, sometimes it doesn't even, their actions don't require hope on their behalf. We don't know how common this is, but it is in our material. We can find people that say, I don't care if we reach the Paris Accord target. I need to do this anyway, because this is the right thing to do.
Which doesn't mean that they don't care about
sorry.
reaching the target.
It doesn't matter. Well, my action, it's not because I want to reach it, but I'm not going to not do it just because the probability of reaching it is low, right? Yeah. So the most important thing is to do the right thing.
And it's interesting that when they mention norms, it's not the flight shame norm, but it's rather the flying norm, which they have overcome. They have been thinking of it for a while, but it was so difficult. There was so much hindering them. It might have been the demands from their employer, or ideas in the family, or the social pressure to fly.
This puts the discussion, the media debate, sort of on its head in Sweden, because we've been talking a lot of flight shame as though that would be what is the most turning point. We should also say that they mention alternatives, and the alternatives are train or other kinds of travel, or just abandon travel and travel less. So those are very strong arguments when they've decided to
And it's
change.
interesting that they kind of renegotiate their view on train traveling, and they talk of it as something positive, with the slowness, the closer experience in their local neighborhood.
And finally, we'd like to also bring out the fact that very often in the discussions on individual action, it is brought, the argument is brought forward that one person more or less doesn't really matter. But these people have realized that that's sort of it's a philosophical argument that falls on its head, right? Because we are all many. And these people actually believe that they matter. And that is very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will open up for some questions, but we'll actually start in Madrid because we have Sven Søyland from Nordic Research Center with us, Nordic Energy Research. I'm sorry, Sven. You have an audience, and I believe you also have some questions. Sven, so just shoot.
Yes, I do have an audience, and there's one in the audience who wants to raise a question, and there might be more. So let's start with this gentleman.
I'm wondering, is that working?
Yes, it is.
I'm wondering to what extent those in Sweden and the other Nordic countries who want to give up flying are also conscious of not eating meat, for example, conscious of the fact that if they live in houses built of bricks and other ceramic materials, the emissions associated with the construction of those materials are very high, are conscious of the fact that if they travel on trains, they're using steel infrastructure, the carbon dioxide cost of producing steel and concrete exceeds that of all the travel sectors very substantially. Is there a spillover of the attitude towards flying to these other areas, or has flying becoming an isolated totem?
Thank you for the question. So I turn back to Stockholm for the authors.
So the study that we've done cannot answer those questions, but in general, we can see that these people are aware on many levels. But what becomes very apparent for them is that the quickest, fastest, and most efficient way of reducing their own emissions is flying. These are very often well-off people, and if you look at a net 10 ton of the average Swedish consumer-based emission, very quickly you realize that this is low-hanging fruit, huge low-hanging fruit.
There's not too much concrete shaming yet. It's more flight shaming.
No, as we said, we don't believe that this is a very functional way for this group, even though we need more research to really know how that works.
So, Stian, if I can throw in a question from Madrid. Many of the people in the audience here have flown to Madrid, and I wonder whether whether you can clarify the difference between flying for pleasure and flying for business, so to speak. Is there any? Can you say anything about that from your study?
Well, we actually asked people if they had reduced their flying in regard to work or in regard to their private life, but we couldn't see any major differences in the type of arguments that they used in the study.
Well, there are people who have flown in work and have been uncomfortable with that and changed work. But we focus on those who could affect their flying. And if you're employed and you need to fly, then these people fall out of the survey.
And they are probably not, haven't even answered our survey, actually.
Because they stopped. It's focused on those who stopped.
Okay.
Any more questions? Yeah, there's one more question here in Madrid, and then we turn back to you afterwards.
Hi, I'm Madeline Weir, and I was just wondering if you talked to any of your participants about there's some airlines that are doing carbon offsets now, or they'll say you can pay an extra sum of money, or you can visit this website to do a carbon offset. And I was just wondering if there was any information from the participants about their thoughts on that.
It's not a big issue in the answers. It's mentioned by some of the participants, but it seemed that they are rather informed that there are problematic dimensions in carbon offsetting that has to do with the high altitude effect and the time scope and so on. But it's not mentioned in this study very much as a solution to the problem. It is, however, a little bit more mentioned in another study that we're doing about people who have not changed their behavior, but we haven't yet had the possibility to analyze it further. But we can see that it's mentioned.
So when will you publish?
Well, that'll.
You mean this other study?
Yes,
during next year.
Okay, yeah, exciting. Any questions from the audience in Stockholm? I might have one. It's more about social responsibility than shaming. How did these results make you feel?
Oh, there's 673 of them, so there are many feelings, I think. Oh, you mean our feelings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have feelings? Yeah.
Well, I think
She has.
I have feelings. Well, I think it's connected to the overall discussion that we're having.
Yeah.
So we're dead scared, right? But we need to act.
Yeah.
So we're also an example of the insight of climate change. The direship can also need to lead to action. So we've been, of course, sometimes we are extremely overwhelmed by the facts, but we also see, as we were saying, the hope in people wanting to make a difference, and that they actually think they do. Yeah. That's the best thing. They think they can make a difference.
And it makes me believe that I can make a difference. They are good role models for me as well, I would say. It's quite hopeful.
Yeah.
And finally, I think it also has to do with the fact that they acknowledge the goal conflicts. Because in the debate, it becomes black and white. It's either or, and we cannot have that. We need to recognize that there are losses here, and we need to choose. And these people realize that, and that's also very hopeful.
And they acknowledge their pain. I mean, it's really painful to give up things that you love to do. And it seems that we need to talk about these these emotions related to the losses, and not believe that everything is easy to solve in a very simple way.
Thank you so much for this uplifting presentation. And where can we find the report?
It's on the webpage of Fores.se, Grounded Beyond Flygskam.
Go online, find a report and read it. Thank you so much, Maria and Nina. You will take a seat now, and you will come back for our panel at the end. But now, let's have Martin Poulsgaard from NISA on the stage. So, planes, they run on fossil fuels, mostly. But there are a lot happening on more sustainable alternative fuel in aviation. And you work for NISA, the Nordic Initiative for Sustainable Aviation, and you will show us where we stand on sustainable aviation fuels in the Nordics.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the two speakers here about flying shame. It's interesting to see on individual and also collective level how it is, how you look at the whole picture. Aviation is the aviation sector is trying to find the solution, so there should be no fear in the future. Unfortunately, the future is long, but we are doing what we can. And I will try to show some of the things. But before doing that, looking at the energy we use, 20 years back, we thought it's a huge problem. 10 years ahead from now, we can use all the energy we want from renewable sources. And hopefully also renewable sources could be a part of the flying future. I hope so. Am I going in the right direction? Yes. NISA, Nordic organization, just to show a lot of members in the organization. I will not go in details because of time. We have on Nordic level 2 years ago made this report you see on the left side about what can we do in the Nordics to get sustainable aviation, to get aviation sustainable. And now it's a little bit old. Time is moving fast, and therefore it was needed with an update. And the update is just released, Sustainable Jet Fuel for Aviation. You can find it also on the internet. Sorry. The global aviation is doing a lot, but also recognizing that the problem is there, and we need to do a lot of things. This is only some figures you can have in mind. What I would say about fuels, or rather propellants for the future. We can see on ordinary things, fossil fuel today, we can have a lot of improvements still, regulating, making aircraft easier and lower weight, I mean. And also you can fly more direct on routes and that kind of things. And technology and new airplanes is on its way. So there are a lot of potentials using fossil fuel. So you have to lower the amount of using fossil fuel. The next one, as you see, biofuel and synthetic alternatives should be sustainable, of course, but there's a limit. We can't get enough of biomass to produce those things. There are other possibilities. If you go to the third level, electrofuels. Here we are talking about a fuel which are, one, independent on feedstocks, and two, it is be cheaper in the future to use that. And at the same time using that progress, I will come back to that, you will reduce the CO2 in the air. And the third one, the fourth one, of course, you will hear about that after me, electric aircraft, as the biggest and most interesting future, to my understanding. On the Nordic level, we are doing a lot of things. Just shortly, in Norway, they have decided a blend-in mandate starting up next year, 0.5% blend-in. In Sweden, they have made an investigation, have the process around that, and in the parliament, they're now discussing, and hopefully, I think, will soon decide that you need to reduce CO2 on flying. And that's a big issue. In Denmark, we have not a decision on political level as Norway and Sweden, but the sector for itself has decided to reduce 30% before 30. And now we have established a partnership on political level saying, you guys in aviation find a solution. We have in Denmark decided 70% reduction in 2030. And now it's up to aviation to find how can we fit into that. And that's a big challenge and interesting. And in the bottom again, electric aircraft, you'll hear about that later. We have a huge climate challenge for sure, even though, to put what you said before about the shame and difficulties to take the decision to fly and that kind of things. At the same time, flying domestic in Sweden use less fuel than on cars you are driving too fast compared to the speed limits. Just to tell you about the size of the things we're discussing. I think that's an interesting thing. In the bottom here, I have stated who is the real problem owner, talking about fuels and aviation. Maybe the fuel providers are the real problem owner because they're not producing things that is accessible for us to fly with in the future. So why not put much more focus on the oil producers? Biofuels, there are 5 tracks you can use if you are going to produce biofuels. They are mentioned here, and you can look at that later. I hope you will have the opportunity to do that because I don't have time to go through it. Biofuels are very limited today. We have one continuous producer in the US, in California, called Altair, or rather World Energy. They produce 0.1% of total use of fuels, so that's really not much. Others are on its way, hopefully also in the Nordic countries soon. In the next 2 or 3 years, I hope we have refineries making different kinds of fuels and electrofuels. There's a lot of criteria that has to be fulfilled to go into the market, because we're talking about sustainable solutions, not other solutions or alternative solutions. Only sustainable solutions are acceptable for the sector, at least when we're talking about the aviation sector in the Nordics. Looking into the possibilities, this is the green areas on the globe. We could say that's a biomass on the globe. So much food, part of the biomass, so much fossil energy are we using today, and here, so much fossil energy, if we do not that much, that's how much we need in 2050. So that's really a challenge. And because of the green things here, you can see the limited possibilities for biofuels is here. Maximum and minimum, the surveys says, the studies says, should be possible to produce biofuel in that volumes, and that's really not much, and that's a globe totally. So there are limited resources. Therefore, we're looking at other alternatives. Future fuel, we call it electrofuels, and we have made a study, a Nordic study, financed by those organizations and companies shown over here, including Nordic Energy Research. That's a total concept for the new electrofuel production. I will go through it very fast. You have the starting point in the study with biogas, because in agricultural countries you have a lot of biogas. Also in Norway and Sweden you have a lot of biogas, and in many other countries, from fishery, from household waste, and from agriculture and other places. So let's take the biogas and use it. And you can do that in different ways. You can combine it with other things you can do with the things from the biogas, and I go very fast. You have the biogas coming up here. You can take the biogas out here, and there's a CO2 emission from there. If you go further, you can see how much can you produce of the biogas in this case, if you're talking about Denmark totally. Speeding up. If you go further, you can make factory produce fuels on basic of methane. If you go further, you can add, you see here, next, electrolysis, and then you can make a better fuel, and you are higher in the amount. And also you can add incineration, and then you are higher again. And next step could be woody biomass from residuals, and then from other sources you could add CO2 from incineration plants, steel plants, and also from the air, capture CO2 from the air. If you use all those synergies together and use the hydrogen to make electrolysis and liquid fuel out of gases, then you have a independent feedstock supply, which are fantastic for the future. And if we do that, we can hopefully go into a scenario where you have the ordinary prices of fuel here today, top and down. The black dots are the price for the upcoming product coming from electrofuels. So that's a really new area I think we will develop in the Nordic countries. We have 2 or 3 studies going on now in Sweden and Norway, and one is on its planning phase in Denmark. Political things has to be taken into account, and now we better go to the next part of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. I know you wanted to talk a lot more, but we have limited time, but you might be able to elaborate at the end, because then we will have a panel if you just take a seat now. Yes. And now I'll invite Anders Forslund, CEO for Heart Aerospace. The vision of I'm from Norway. So, yeah, and the vision of our airport operator, Avinor, is that all domestic flights, commercial flights, shall be electric by 2030. Yeah, you know.
Yes.
What a foresight. Is this realistic? You might have the answers here, Anders.
Yeah,
the floor
that's
is yours.
a really good question to ask. But yeah, so Norway started this entire thing when they, in January of 2018, declared that they want all short-haul flights to be 100% electric by the year 2040. In Sweden, we have a similar agenda where we talk about having all domestic flights fossil fuel-free by 2030, but it also includes the solutions that Martin was talking about. Now, and there's also things happening in Finland and in Iceland, and Maria will talk about what happened this week about the Nordic network for electric aviation, where airlines and airport operators from all Nordic countries, including Greenland, come together to discuss these matters. Now, electric aircraft are already here. This would be the first generation of electric aircraft. It's been around for about 3 years. These are the light sport aircrafts, or you might call them the trainer aircraft. And these are impressive aircraft. I've flown them myself, and there are aircraft like this in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, etc. And they can stay airborne for about 1 hour, and they can cover distances of up to 180 kilometers. So it's already here. But it is a quite limited plane. It can seat 2 passengers, so you can't really use this for any type of commercial air travel or commercial transportation. But what happened this week, only on Tuesday, was very exciting, because we saw the first of what I would think is the second generation of electric aircraft. And this was actually an aircraft from 1947. This is a de Havilland Beaver, but it's equipped with an electric motor and running on batteries. And this aircraft can take 6 passengers and a pilot. And if you compare these two, this aircraft actually has a 10 times more powerful engine than the one on top. And even though it's a 1947 aircraft, the batteries are good enough for it to fly 160 kilometers. But this is not where the development stops. So my company is working from our hangar in Gothenburg, Sweden, on developing what I think is the 3rd generation of electric aircraft. And this is it. This is the Heart ES-19. It's an entirely new built aircraft that seats 19 passengers and has an electric range of 400 kilometers, all on batteries. We will show our flying prototype in 2022, and by 2025 we'll be certified for commercial service. And this is a new aircraft. It's more aerodynamic. It's using the latest technology, but it's based a lot on the things that have been shown in these previous aircraft. In fact, the motors that we're running on our aircraft are a little bit less powerful than the one that was demonstrated yesterday. So this is really exciting. We can now start using aircraft like this, for instance, to fly over 1/3 of the domestic distances in Sweden, and similar numbers in Europe, and over 50% in Norway. But this is still just a small portion of all flights available. So can this really make a difference on global emissions? Can electrification really do that? Well, I think that you're not going to be flying to Thailand anytime soon in an all-electric battery aircraft. But if you look at it, over 85% of departures worldwide and 40% of emissions are from short-haul travels. That's travel of around 2,000 kilometers. And if we have a doubling of battery energy density, we can do these flights with 1 stopover. So this can have a really potential impact. And also, this week on Tuesday, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded for the invention of the lithium-ion batteries. So there's been a big discussion of what we can expect from lithium-ion batteries in the decades to come. And I think there's a very good chance that we will have these batteries by the year 2030, One of these Nobel laureates, John Goodenough, is working on one of those batteries right now, even though he's 97 years old, which I think is incredible. But I think another thing that's perhaps as important as reducing the existing emission is to start a new mode of transport around electric aircraft. They will not operate exactly in the identical way of the traditional aircraft. We will see a lot of new uses, and that's because of the fact that these aircraft are actually a lot more cheaper to operate. You reduce fuel cost by somewhere between 50 and 90%, depending on what the electricity cost. You reduce maintenance cost by about 50% on the aircraft level. So perhaps the biggest use of electric aircraft will be in new markets, and perhaps in those countries that today have a very underdeveloped infrastructure. It's kind of like with a mobile phone, an invention that was pioneered in the Nordic countries, but then had its greater use in the developed world. So I think we have a similar future for electric aircraft. It's something that doesn't need roads, it doesn't need rails, and it has a very low carbon footprint. Finally, I want to say something about the global goals. This project that I have and this company that we're running started as a direct consequence of the UN global goals that was set in 2015. We received our first funding from the Swedish government in a call that aimed specifically at this. And I think this is important to acknowledge that although we are not doing enough, and we know that we're not doing enough to meet these goals for 2030, we're doing something right, and something is happening, and we should be scared, but we should also feel hope. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders. And you will also take a seat and join our panel at the end. And now, Maria Fiskerud, you come from the Research Institutes of Sweden, or RISE, a network of research and technology organizations which do industrial research and innovation. And the Swedish aviation strategy states that aviation shall contribute to the goal of Sweden becoming one of the world's first fossil-free welfare states. And RISE is currently pursuing several projects that will contribute to this changeover.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I think one important thing here, yes, we are mainly a technical research institute, but we also have the service innovation part. And I think this is the thing here, that we need to connect the market with the technical research, because there is a premium price on the sustainable aviation fuel as well as on the electric aviation, at least in the beginning. So we need to get those two together. I would also like to start to talk a little bit about being carbon smart. And I think that's important in all parts of our lives, and especially when I don't really know what to choose, or I usually think about my grandchild, Theo, and that makes it easy for me to try to choose the right things. So we can stay as low, below 2 degrees as possible. And I do think that's one part that you talked about as well, that it's important that it becomes personal in a way, because that's when we do action, that's when we do change. But I would like to complicate your story a little bit, because if we go back to the beginning of the 1900, and we just pretend like we had the same discussion, the same knowledge as we have today, but we were discussing trains. And if we did have the same knowledge and the same discussions as we had today, then we will probably shut down all trains and we will stop using the train, because they were driven by coal at the time. So my point here is that it's not really the transportation itself, it's the energy or the fuel that we need to change. And we have heard about 2 examples. Martin have talked about sustainable aviation fuel and electric fuels, and Anders have talked about electric aviation. And there is no silver bullet. So we probably need to look into all of these. And we are in the beginning, And we are front runners here in the Nordics. We have been first among in sustainable aviation, using sustainable aviation fuel. We have been the first to start using it on our airports and so on and so forth. And here in the Nordics, we actually have the choice to fly on sustainable aviation fuel when we buy our tickets at our main airplane owners. And we also have an economic non-profit organization called Fly Green Fund, where I can pay for sustainable aviation fuel for my travel. And then we have the electric aviation that we are talking about, and hopefully you need to fix this, Anders, and so we can start flying on it 2025. But there is still technical things to do before we are there. And exactly as Anders also talked about, it's good that we get these, that the politicians go together and give us high demands, because that will start funders to give money, or organizations like the Nordic Innovation or Nordic Energy Research to fund money so we can find solutions. But we need to do the aviation industry, and even if we do have done a lot in the Nordics, it's been a little bit here and a little bit there, maybe on a country level, maybe even on a regional level, but we need to do it together, because we need to get a faster pace, and we need to get 1 + 1 to become 3. So then we need to collaborate, and we are good at collaboration in the Nordics as well. So these are the two networks that we are working with. The first one is the Fossil-Free Aviation 2045. That actually came out of the Fossil-Free Sweden that you might have heard of. And in Fossil-Free Sweden, the different industries have done the roadmaps, and one roadmap is for aviation. So the Fossil-Free Aviation 2045 is actually the cluster that should make this happen. But what we also found in the cluster is that even in the industry itself is doing the roadmap, that's not enough any longer. When we talk about sustainable solutions, a little bit like Martin talked about as well, then sometimes we get the sustainable aviation producer says, we really want to do this, but we need to know that the industry will pay. And the industry says, we really want to buy this, but you need to tell us what the cost is. And then they can all say that we want this, but no one really wants to take the first steps. So we want to, together, everyone in the same room, because we all want the same solution. We want to be able to fly in the future as well. The organizations in the middle here are actually part of both these two networks. And the other network, I will tell you, and that Anders also talked about, is the Nordic Network for Electric Aviation. And we actually had our first meeting last week up in Östersund. And up in Östersund, they also had the Green Flyway meeting as well, which is also a big Nordic, Swedish-Norway project. And that's the way we need to work. We cannot afford to not work together, so we can give each other insight and maybe and take it a step further. I will tell you a little bit more about that as well. What's really important here, I think, with the Nordic Network is actually we have all the airports, we have all the airliners in the Nordics working together. That's quite unique. And I think Anders and Martin also mentioned it. I think this is the way we can contribute to the rest of the world as well. We can continue to be the leaders in this field. We can go ahead and show it's possible here. For example, before the 2020, the Tokyo Olympics this summer, when they 6 years ago looked at a map and saw where should we go to get our Olympics really, really sustainable, and we want people to fly here to come to Japan to see our Olympics. Then when they looked at the map, they ended up in Karlstad in Sweden, small town, small airport, but first in the world to deliver sustainable aviation fuel, and Oslo. So they, in a very close circle, they got both the big airport and the smaller airport, and could bring it back. And now they have actually bought electrofuels and will have more sustainable aviation fuel for their Olympics. So we can go ahead and then we can export the knowledge and what we are doing. What's important when we work together in the network for fossil-free aviation, we have these two goals. It's fossil-free domestic aviation 2030 and fossil-free all aviation 2045 for Sweden. So this was our first conference when we gathered everyone. And we were actually 109 people from 68 different organizations. And that's needed because that's how big the ecosystem is to really solve this. But what we have got most PR about, or what people have been talking most about this last year is electric aviation. Before this year, I would say we haven't hardly heard about it, but this year everyone is talking about electric aviation. And that's really good because, as I said, we need all these technical solutions. But sometimes I'm a little bit afraid that we might jump from one to another. We also need to do, like Anders is talking about, and we need more people to do in the sustainable aviation fuel part as well. So these are the 3 or 4 work packages that we are working together with in the whole of the Nordics. It's standards, and Anders talked a little bit about that. In the Nordics, for the telecom business, the GSM and NMT was standards that we worked together with here in the Nordics that we then exported globally, and we hope to do the same for electric aviation. Business models, this is a totally new way of transportation, a totally new way of mobility. In areas where we might not have the best roads, where we have fjords in Norway or whatever, we can start to have regional transport. It's like buses with wings, I would say, more or less. Also, we can see only 2% of the traveling in Nordics are not between a capital or involving a capital. So we need this to collaborate even more. Weatherproofing. If we can make an airplane that works in the Nordics, it will work everywhere. We have the worst weather. We have icing. We have everything. And we have a really short, what do you call it? Landing runways. We have really short runways as well. So that's also good. So if we make it more clear, it will work everywhere. And we need to collaborate. We need to tell the story of what we are doing here to show the world it's possible so they can do it as well. But we also need to look, this is an international global business, so we also need to go out there and see what's happening globally and bring it back. So we need to collaborate in the Nordics. We are the 11th biggest economy if we do work together in the Nordics. If we should do, as Norway has said, that all domestic aviation should be on electric aviation 2040, that would save 2 million tons of CO2 from the Nordics, if we do it in the whole of the Nordics. But I also think we need to collaborate more on a sustainable aviation fuel side, so we really get the investments. We need the money in here in this field. We have the technique, we have an industry that's waiting, but we need the finance, and we need the bold politicians that set the right goals for us.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. You can just stay.
Okay.
I will ask you a question, and then the other presenters can come to the stage right now. Just take a stand. I was just wondering, in the beginning we heard that a lot of people in Sweden have stopped flying, a decline in the number of passengers. And in this transition, because that means some companies lose a lot of money, and you need money for innovation. Yeah. And this transition period, you need a lot of innovation. So there seemed to be some kind of problem there.
Yeah, and this is a difficulty, but that's it's some of the business models. For example, the Fly Green Fund, where they look into buying sustainable aviation fuel now, used today. They also use some part of the money they get into projects to solve it in the more longer run. I think this is an area where we need to have two thoughts in the head at the same time, which is difficult and a little bit scary as well, to be honest. But to think both in the short run and what we need to do here and now, but also in the longer run. Because as Anders was talking about, I mean, when we have the electric aviation, I mean, in the part of Sweden where I live, we don't have the best roads. I mean, this could be a help. And also if we think about railway as well, or the infrastructure needed for, well, roads, railway, or for the other transport, that's not needed in the same way. And we have all the airports we actually need. Yeah.
Martin, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, the same question you asked, you could say about making tax on aviation. And that's a discussion that we can, of course, take. There are taxes in Sweden, in Norway, in Germany, and other places. In Denmark, there's no taxes, but the sector in Denmark has proposed to make a voluntary, not a tax, but a contribution. And all the money should go to development projects like electric developments and fuels and so on. And we think that's a much better way that everybody else could learn of. We don't know if it will be decided, but we hope so. But I think it's a really good idea, because if it goes into the tax fiscal part, then you don't know if the development will take place. So it's a really strong message from us. Make that kind of solutions.
Madrid, do you hear us?
Yes, we do, and it's been very interesting. I just wanted to give a brief remark to those who have tried to get through this very long presentations that with a lot of content. All the presentations will be uploaded on the Nordic Energy Research website, together with the presentations there. So don't worry, there will be links to the reports as well. So can I take a question from the audience?
Robert Brown, in a sense, a little bit boring. Back to small modular reactors. They're very good at cracking hydrogen from water. Add that to carbon dioxide extraction from the atmosphere, and there's a highly efficient plant on display here. Put that next to a petroleum type plant, get an oil company to fund it. You can get them to kind of change direction into being part of the solution, as against just being part of the perceived problem. They're not, they supply energy that we require, but a public perception, and maybe a new direction in which they could go, which would supply aviation and other fuels that are CO2 free.
Thank you for that comment. There's another question as well, and then we go back to you in Stockholm.
Yes, I'm John Englert from Australia, so I've come a very long way here by plane. My question revolves around long-haul aviation and how we can resolve this, because I think that sector is growing and it's problematic. It's problematic just for Australia's domestic aviation emissions. We've got 2 of the top domestic global flight routes in Australia, and a 3rd flight route is just outside the top 10. So where do you see this going for medium and long haul aviation? Solutions for those. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Stockholm.
Yes. I think you made, this is kind of a weird setting just now, because we're looking at the screen, so now we have a panel again, and then Martin, yes?
Yes, the electric flight we heard about is not for long haul so far. Maybe in the future, 10, 20, 40 years ahead. But the big producers, the big producers are trying to find hybrid solutions where they can maybe take some of the energy used for long haul by batteries, and make some of the energy they want to use made by power from electricity. That's a possibility, and it is under development now. We had at the conference in Östersund the other day presentations from Rolls-Royce, the biggest producer of engines, and they're really going into research on how can we combine the fuel engine with electricity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think also from one of our members in the project from Iceland, they are talking about they don't have it too far from Iceland to the US. So maybe what they are thinking about is maybe to going in small heaps, and maybe that could work as well. And that might be earlier than the long haul flights with electricity.
Yeah.
Never done that before.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to challenge you now. In 20 years, how does aviation look like? Or traveling, maybe? For me, as a passenger, we'll start from...
The other day I had a discussion with a guy, expert in drones, and he said very soon we will have and see passenger drones. And looking at Denmark, now you can talk about Sweden and Norway, but in Denmark there are 31 airports, only 10 are in use today. But with drones and passenger drones, it should be possible to connect all those 31 airports in 10 years' time from now. Then the question is it with a pilot or without a pilot on the ground or whatever? I don't know, but that could be a part of the solution.
Okay, yeah. Nina?
So I think for you, you're probably not going to fly because unless you're a government official or a really top scientist or someone with an increasing a lot of money, maybe you will fly. But I think the mobility patterns are going to have to change drastically if we're going to reach the Paris Agreement. So for you as a passenger, I'm not sure you'll be a passenger on a plane in 20 years.
In what way will they change, do you think?
I think we will have to limit it, and also from a justice perspective, we need to think about how to balance the frequent flying of the global north with the flying of the south and the east. So I think we need to look at this not just from our very wealthy Nordic perspective, but a global one, since this is a global issue.
Anders?
Well, the year was 2040, right?
Yes.
2040. Yeah, I think that we will have maybe not all, but most of the short-haul flights will be all electric. We will be in the middle of the big ramp up where maybe more than 50% will be electric. And as for what happens with, I think this is an interesting point as well, but what happens in people's perceptions will definitely change. But I think definitely there's a place for aviation if there's zero emissions.
Well, yeah.
I find this discussion both very hopeful when I hear about the electrification of aviation and so on, and very scary because I think there is a missing perspective. And Nina was a little bit into it. We know that we have to, in the short term, we have to reduce flying drastically, and it's going up. And when I hear about those ideas about the biofuel and so on, and new markets, and to me it doesn't sound like reducing it. It sounds like finding new ways of flying more. And it's really worrying in the light of what I know about emissions. And another thing that I really would like to discuss is the problem with the high altitude effect, because to my knowledge there isn't much difference with the biofuel with the effect, and it doesn't help with the carbon offsetting and so on because lots of emissions. Aviation on a high level, not the short haul flights, but the longer, they are on such a height that their emissions doesn't compose in the same way as it does on ground. And that means that to researchers that we work with, they count on the double effect. And and it doesn't help doing carbon offsetting on the ground when the emissions are left in the atmosphere. So there are problems that we have to talk about, and and that I really hope that the flying industry and the innovators and so on will be parts of that discussion. Yeah.
That is really important. But just to take the high, for the electric aviation, there's
that's
none,
not a problem.
Yeah. And for the sustainable aviation fuel, is not that much research done, but the research that's been done shows that it's less, or it's what would you call it?
Bit less.
Is no 60 to 80% less.
That's not the numbers I've heard, but.
Well, that's what NASA says, and
Okay.
that they are the ones that have done the research. So that's one part, but that's not part of the fuel, because you can also learn how to fly, so you don't fly in the areas where you have very high, what do you call that, humidity? What do you call that even in the sky? Because this is water. Yeah, so if you can learn, maybe we can, in the airplanes today, they know very well about the weather. So if we can learn, and if we as travelers can accept that the plane maybe go a little bit up and down, depending on how the weather is in the sky, maybe that could reduce it. So there is also a lot of new research that we could do. So this is an area that hasn't really been looked into. So maybe there is solutions there as well.
I think one thing that is very striking to me, as I think that when we're in our little bubble here in the Nordic countries, we think that the rest of the world is talking about exactly the same things we are in Sweden. And we talk about flight shame like it's a global phenomenon, and I think we're seeing in many countries that it is starting to spread, but we shouldn't. I think it's that there's a big thing happening, with the rising middle class in much more populous parts of the world, that we also need to find ways to contribute to, and I think that. Not looking at the technological solutions for this is as a solution is a mistake. I think this is the only way that we can actually read it. It's not going to happen automatically, but if we forget about the technological perspective of this, I don't see that it's going to be good by 2040.
Martin first, and then Nina.
I would say that I agree. We can't. I think it's at 8 or 10% of the total population globally that has been flying. So it's not possible to get all the people on the globe flying in the next upcoming years. So of course, I think we should think of flying and aviation in the same way as we think about driving and eating and using energy and so on. Use less. If you can, that's fine. Fine with me. Maybe not. Some of my members will say we need the growth, but personally, I think we should think in that direction. So I agree on that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't find technical solutions. So we have to do all of the things at the same time.
Nina, you are lucky now because you will have the last word.
I also think that we need technical solutions, but I think history of technology teaches us that they are not so quick as we would like them to be. So we need to combine them with other solutions as well.
Thank you so much for the panel. Thank you for the audience in Madrid, and thank you, Sven. This is the last event of the Nordic Climate Action Weeks and our Nordic Pavilion in Madrid. Maybe we'll see you in Glasgow next year. I don't know. Anyway, I wish you a good weekend and happy Christmas.